Welcome once again to the Windy City's finest, on location with Mac and Perry. He's Mac, I'm Perry, and this is
Daniel Audet.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really curious if you could just give us a brief blurb about yourself and what you do.
I'm an oil painter. I paint landscapes, animals, and people.
Yeah, and we have some right now in the background, but we'll be diving into that stuff in the next couple segments with Mac and myself. For this segment, though, I'm super excited to just kind of play some icebreaker games, get to know you a little bit, and maybe create some connection points for our audience. And the first thing we'd like to do, in the spirit of being on location here in Lethbridge, we just have some multiple choice location-themed questions. And they're, multiple choice, so I'll just dive in and read the first one for you.
Sounds good.
The Oliver Block, built at the turn of the 20th century and located in downtown Lethbridge, was named as such because A, its first primary tenant was an olive factory, B, its original floor plan roughly resembled an olive, C, its owner's name was William Oliver, or D, the majority of its interior was painted with an olive-like hue.
I'm going to go William Oliver.
Yes! Yeah, you got it. That was a fun fact that I looked up. And there you go, a little bit about the city.
This block?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Our next question for you here is the Melcor Centre in downtown Lethbridge has an office tower consisting of how many stories? A, 8 stories, B, 10 stories, C, 11 stories, or D, 13 stories?
8 stories.
Not quite. No, it was C, 11 stories. 11, make a wish. That's how I thought of it. But yeah.
Okay.
Bit of a guessing game, maybe.
Lethbridge
I don't know how you
more
would.
impressive than I think.
It's got the taller buildings than we thought. Awesome. Fantastic. Our next little game that we have is this or that. So I'm going to grab the hat. Wow. And this is just like coffee or tea. And then, we'll kind of go through a couple. Both?
Yeah,
Interesting.
So it's, this might be a hard game.
Okay. I'll let you do the honors and go first. And if you could read it out.
Fly or drive?
Ooh.
Probably drive. I actually enjoy driving now. So.
Have you had many opportunities to fly?
A few. I've been on quite a few planes, and it's always a miserable experience. You're just crammed in and thinking, I want this to be over as soon as possible. But whereas driving, you have the autonomy and the open road. You're in a car commercial, kind of just enjoying life. And, So definitely drive.
Nice, right on. I think I don't know that I've had such negative experiences when flying. But it's more of a novelty, I think, for myself.
Okay.
Like
you haven't
every once
flown
in
a lot?
Sorry?
You haven't flown a lot?
Not really, no.
Okay.
And so it's more of a novelty, I think, for myself currently. So
Sure.
yeah. I'll jump along to the next one here. Whoop. Lake or ocean?
Ooh, lake. I'm a prairie kid, so the ocean freaks me out. I mean, it's interesting, but there's an intensity there that I wouldn't want to hang out for a long time.
That's very fair, yeah. And like here in Alberta, we're very much landlocked.
Yeah, so the ocean is like pretty foreign.
Yeah.
Intense, but it's different.
Yeah, and Canada's surrounded by 3 of them. So there's
Right, but in Albertan, they're so far away, they're just abstract concepts until you're there and you go, oh wow, okay.
Yeah. And do you have lots of experience? Like, were you around lakes lots growing up?
No, not really.
No?
Like I grew up by a river, so being close to water is something that I connect with, but it's a very particular kind of river, so it's very chill. Yeah, the Milk River is the calmest, slowest river possible, so it's the total opposite of the ocean, I would say.
Yeah. Interesting. Very cool. I don't know, for myself. I mean, I think when I've been to lakes, I have thoroughly enjoyed myself. So I'd probably go with lakes too.
Yeah, like water skiing, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I have done that a few times, and it is difficult. It is not easy.
No.
Okay, I'll let you do the honors.
All right. Book or movie? Ooh. That's a tough one. I mean, I really love movies, but I also love books. So that's my coffee or tea thing. I think I like both, but pretty much the book is always better, with the exception of maybe Fight Club. I think the movie's better than the book. Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, they're pretty close, but because I'm a visual artist, I got to go movie.
Oh, interesting. So. Okay. And what more can you tell me about that? Like, does it depend on the day?
I'm really inspired by cinema. Like, I watch a lot of film, so just seeing the imagery, the color, the compositions, like I look to cinema a lot. It's something I kind of do on a regular part of my process. Like, I have a really good home theater set up, and I turn the lights down and crank the sound and really try and immerse myself in film. I think it's part of my aesthetic language. So yeah, it's a big influence in my painting. And lately I've been combining imagery in paintings, kind of like that Kuleshov technique, where you can have the neutral face and you cut to the bowl of soup or cut to the whatever, and it changes your relationship to the face. It's like, can you do that in a still painting? And so I've been collaging in images in the bottom that are a different thing to kind of juxtapose with the top part of the image to create a new meaning from that kind of contrast. So yeah, film is a big influence.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, collage was the word that was coming to mind, and
yeah.
I'm super excited to maybe learn more about that moving forward. But I would be really curious, like, when do you think, what came first, or when did your passion for film or painting?
I always wanted to do film. Like, actually, painting was sort of a holdover to go to film school, be a filmmaker, kind of tell those kind of stories. And then I ended up just painting and was always there, and it kept getting better and better, and film was more and more frustrating the further into the process I got. I kept realizing, like, oh, you have to collaborate with all these other people, and there's certain things you can't do, or it's expensive, and it's just, like, I still think it's one of the most beautiful mediums when it's done really well, but there's something about painting where I have sort of total control, and the more I learned about painting, the more I could just, whatever idea I had, I could sort of seep that into the painting. And film, there was too many barriers, and so I kept turning away and going into painting. But I mean, who knows? I might get into film again at some point, because it is amazing. But I feel like they overlap in so many ways.
Absolutely. And the parallel I'm drawing right there is that it sounds like film is like you're flying, and driving is like you're painting. You have a bit more autonomy.
Yeah, like there's a constraint. Yeah, you're on the plane, and you're not flying the plane unless you become the pilot, which is like, there's a lot of hurdles, and I didn't get over all those hurdles. So then painting is my thing right now. But
that's awesome.
Yeah, maybe I'll go back to film at some point. But.
Yeah. Awesome. I will do one more here, and we'll move swiftly along. Wow. Breakfast or dinner?
Dinner. Yeah. I skip breakfast a lot. I don't usually have an appetite in the morning, so I tend to try and force myself to eat something kind of simple. But dinner I can get excited about, cook it, and sort of spend the time, and definitely.
And do you think, like, was that always a thing growing up, like with your family?
Yeah. No, I never had an appetite in the morning. My dad used to give me like bacon sandwiches as I walked out the door, because I would be, the last kid up, and it's like the school bus is in the yard, it's time to go, and I'm like, okay, and I'm just getting on the bus, and there'd be like a paper towel wrapped around 2 pieces of toast stuffed full of bacon, and he's like, take this on the bus, and it's like, well, I don't have an appetite, but everybody likes bacon, so you can eat that. So that was my breakfast a lot of the time. So.
In the UK, do you know what they call that?
Oh,
it's called a bacon butty.
Bacon butty?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
it's a real sandwich. It's not just an easy way to have breakfast.
Yeah.
Nice.
Anyway, that's awesome. Yeah. And we'll move swiftly along to our tumbling towers here. Each block corresponds to a question. We can't use the top 3 rows, and I'll let you do the honors and go first.
Yeah. And I guess whatever block you touch, you have to go with, right? Is that how that tumbling tower works?
That is not how we've been doing it currently. Yeah,
Good.
you can kind of see which ones are good to go, and
27.
27.
Oh, the 27 club, that's a bad number.
Well, I mean, it kind of ties into our earlier conversation. What's a book you couldn't put down?
Couldn't put down? House of Leaves pops into my mind. Like, that's such a strange book. It's like part book, part visual experience, because there's like pages where you're looking through the page, and they printed it so you're looking at the back of the text, and it's a really bizarre book. It's kind of like meta horror almost. Like, it's written as it's found by a stripper in the trunk of a car or something, and you're reading it as like, is this fiction, is it fact? And it's about a house that's bigger on the inside than the outside, and it starts to go into kind of cosmic horror, and a very strange, unique book. But you have to see it. You couldn't do it as an audiobook. So you're reading like certain word, every time the word house shows up, I think it's in blue or red, kind of like Jesus in the Bible. Like, it's got this real aesthetic quality to it. So yeah, that one comes to mind. But yeah, I read a lot of books, so there's a lot of books I can't really put down. But yeah, that one.
Do you find that you often like will come back to them after a certain amount of time?
Yeah, there's certain books I'll reread, or like audiobooks is kind of my main thing now. So I'll be painting, listening to different books, and play stuff over and over. And like, there's a Rick Rubin book, The Creative Act, that I could listen to that maybe once a year. Yeah.
I think it's awesome to have those kind of like touchstones, or just that kind of, I don't know, do you find it, maybe we'll get into it later, but that it lets you kind of like focus elsewhere, and then things just kind of happen in the foreground?
Oh yeah, like a white noise for people. Like some people play like a movie, or like the audio track or something of a film, or like the commentary or whatever, where it's just like, it's a long familiar thing to kind of quiet the head noise or something. That sometimes helps.
Nice. Okay, we'll see what we have here. Let's go with this one. 16. Who is someone who inspires you?
Well, we were talking about David Lynch earlier, and I would say, he has been a huge inspiration to me. I mean, it's interesting that he started out as a painter and wanted to make paintings that moved, and sort of moved into film from that, but painting was always a huge part of his practice, and really he was just an artist in sort of every material that he could come across. But his approach to his artistic practice, and then the more that I've kind of learned about him over the years, like his way of meditating, and kind of, he said, you don't have to live a dark life to make dark art. Like this sort of myth of the tortured artist, and the romantic idea of like becoming an alcoholic and living alone and just spiraling into despair to make really emotionally powerful work. It's like, no, you can actually cultivate bliss in your life and have good relationships with people and be kind, but still like be aware of the darkness. So it's like he wasn't sort of doing the happy dance and being really saccharine, but he was also living in this sort of balance. So that I feel like there's something to be said in what he does.
It brings to mind that idea of collage. It's like the contrast, the juxtaposition of like, maybe you actually do need some bliss and some peace in your life in order to be able to understand the different weight of the...
But to totally ignore the darkness is disingenuous too. And so like his films are pretty dark, pretty strange, but he wasn't that in his own sort of life necessarily. And I find that kind of contrast interesting, and I think it had a lot to do with his meditation and finding that calm balance where he's able to sort of see these things but not necessarily get swept up in them and disappear into those toxic holes that we see people disappearing into all the time in various ways.
Oh, so much there that we could unpack. But I think for the interest of keeping moving along and getting to know you a bit more, I'll let you pick the next ball.
Okay. This is a wobbly.
There we go. 13?
13. Oh man, my unlucky numbers are stacking up.
What is the highlight of your week? I guess we've just started, so maybe last week. Hot yoga is actually one of my, it kind of takes me out of whatever else I'm doing and grounds me in a way, or I try and ground myself in a certain way. So it's a interesting thing, and it's sort of me saying, oh, I'm going to take care of myself instead of paint, or sort of burn out on different projects. It's like, oh, I'm taking time to sort of look after myself in that way that we don't always do, where it's like, oh, I'll look after other people, but we tend to put ourselves last sometimes. So I'd say that's a good highlight. Yeah, and I love what you're saying about taking care of yourself. It's like the one project that you do need to pay attention to sometimes. But it can be on the bottom of the list because you're like, well, I want to do these projects and I need to do this stuff for these other people, and you start to make
bigger and bigger lists, and yeah, self-care gets pushed to the side often. So I feel like when I do show up to my mat or that kind of thing, it's like, oh, this is good. Like I'm making the right kind of space for everything.
Lovely. And when did you think that started?
I feel like it's been just a slow creep, like looking at things like David Lynch or other artists and listening to their podcasts and hearing like the horror story version where they're chained to the easel and they're painting for a gallery and they're maybe selling $20,000 paintings, but they're saying like, I'm not making a living. It takes me 6 months to do a painting, and they're ignoring their family and their friends, and they're just like sitting there painting. And it's like, that sounds miserable. They sound miserable. And I think, well, that's okay. I don't want to go in that space. Like, you want to share your work with people and you want to sell it and make a living and all those things, but it's like, obviously they're unbalanced, and you can hear it in their voice, and it's like, okay, how do I take active steps to not end up in that sort of prison of your own practice, basically. So
I love that. That was so succinct, that last couple words there, prison of your own practice. That was very succinct. And I think that's all the time we have for this segment. So I'm very happy to kind of close off on that note and get to know you a little bit more in the following segments. But yeah, that's all the time we have for this segment. So this has been the Windy City's Finest on location with Mac and Perry. He's Mac. I'm
Welcome to the Windy City's Finest on location with Mac and Perry. I'm Mac. He's Perry, and this is
Daniel.
Yeah, well, Daniel, thank you so much for agreeing to chat with us here. You chatted with Perry about your life and getting to know you a bit, but I also want to talk about your art and learn about your artistic process and all about your journey and stuff. It'll be good. Yeah, I think maybe I know you kind of gave a brief overview at the very beginning, but tell me a bit about like you as an artist. What sort of art do you make?
Well, I make oil paintings predominantly. I mean, I'm interested in a lot of things, but that's been my focus for most of my artistic career, is just drilling down on oil paint, because it allows me to explore so many types of imagery, and the paint itself is something that was sort of love at first sight with oil paint. So I keep coming back to that, and I grew up in a rural area in Southern Alberta, and that, I think, influenced my practice in a way that I basically was an isolated, almost outsider artist, and could kind of try and do whatever I wanted to do, and eventually went to art school and have studied in New York a little bit and sort of expanded into the larger world, and the internet has really opened up the possibility to see everything. But that isolation in the beginning, I think, informed my practice to really allow it to be my own unique take on things before I got pulled into the larger stream of the art world, I would say.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, well, we can talk more about that. So, you grew up in a rural area, and you were more isolated. And so, like, when did you first start painting or drawing or?
Well, I first started oil painting in junior high, and I remember like vividly kind of opening the first tube and squeezing it out, and the smell of the linseed oil, and just being like, whoa, whatever this is for me. And I wanted to do it because I was doing this art by distance learning. Like, we only had art up to grade 10 or whatever, or maybe it was grade 7, but there was a 10 art class, and then 20 and 30 you could do them by distance learning if you wanted, which you would get a course module in, and it's like, do a self-portrait in the box below. And I was like, oh, that sucks. But I was going to the library looking at the painting books and things, and would see oil on canvas next to these images that I was just in love with, and it's like, oh, what is this oil stuff? I need to get some of that. So I bought some oil paint and squeezed it out, and it was like, oh yeah, this is my paint for sure. So that kind of set me off. But before that, I was, doing ceramics and different little projects in school that they would have in, like, the sandbox and like all of that. I was always very interested in that stuff, but I didn't think of it as like, oh, I want to be a painter until, I first started playing with paint in junior high.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. And you mentioned, like, you saw those oil paintings before you started even oil painting. how they had kind of different types of images, or like, yeah, tell me
Yeah,
more
just
about that.
stuff
Yeah.
I was drawn to. Like I remember looking at like Francis Bacon or like Goya or something, like really weird, dark, kind of strange paintings, and being like, oh, this stuff exists, and like this, I'm connecting to this emotionally, and I feel like, oh, this is the kind of thing I want to make, and color itself is something that's been a fascination of mine forever, and just not quite articulating that at the time or realizing it, but it's like that's part of what drew me to oil paint itself, is the richness of the color and the ability to just blend color and shift tone, and it took me years and years to kind of build up the craft and technique to have the language to really start to make the paintings that I was wanting to make in the beginning. But there's something about, like, it would just give you a little bit more as you kept going. Like you put some time into painting and you would level up a little bit and level up, and like you would always, and I still, every bit I put into my practice, I keep leveling up, and there's no end to the levels. So it's just like this, it just sucks you in and off you go, and it's like you can spend 10 lifetimes in it.
Absolutely, yeah. Like I'm sure, like any art, yeah.
Yeah, most good material, like chess, or like there's so many things that are just, the complexity is infinite, and you can just soak into that and disappear, and never, it's unsolvable. So it makes it a really great pursuit.
Absolutely, yeah. And so you're experimenting with oil paintings when you're younger, and so for like maybe how long were you like doing that before you decided I want to go to New York and study arts?
I always wanted to go to art school, so it was kind of like, yeah, this is what I'm going to do, but I didn't necessarily think like, oh, I'm going to become a painter or something specifically. It was just like art to me was, yeah, you can do all these different things, and then it just, over the years, like other interests sort of fell away or were put on pause, and painting just kept giving back more, and there's something about my personality and my interest in color and my ability to see color in certain situations where I feel like, oh, I'm reading like a bit of orange in this shadow, and oh, there's a bit of green in this other one, and I'd be talking to artist friends, and they're like, what are you talking about? It's dark out. And I'm like, well, I'm seeing like a little bit of a shimmer here. So it's like, oh, this material is something I can express those ideas that I'm already seeing and experiencing. So
Interesting, yeah. And did you notice that early on, that kind of ability to see the colors differently?
no, that's more recent, in like maybe the last 8 or 10 years or something, where, you know, just talking to other artists. Like I used to live in Calgary, and so I've developed a really good community of artists up there, and having deep conversations with professional artists, and learning a lot in those conversations, and figuring, you know, how to the different approaches. Like there's so many different approaches you can have to even just painting itself, but then the larger visual art world of like, there's so many materials you can use, and so it's been kind of, that was kind of it.
Yeah. I guess that makes sense. I'm not a painter, but yeah, because I guess you wouldn't necessarily, you'd have to be talking with other artists in order to discuss what each person sees, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're painting by yourself, then you would just be painting by yourself.
Yeah, you just assume, well, whatever I experience is what everybody experiences, and it's like, actually, no, not at all. Like we're all kind of unique in our own subjectivity, and that's part of the joy of art, is kind of connecting to someone else's and saying, oh yeah, I see something in what they're doing that resonates with me and reminds me of my own subjectivity, and so then you feel that connection, but it's like there's so much of it it's foreign to each other, but it's like, it's really interesting to experience those things in other people's art. Like I consume a lot of art being an artist, and I always find it weird if you go to an artist's house and they're like, oh, I don't really hang stuff up. Like I make work, but I don't have my own work or other people's work up, and it's like, why? Like, shouldn't you love living with art? Isn't that part of the whole thing? Like, so I'm constantly looking at paintings, watching film, reading, like listening to music, like just trying to experience art and have the art life and the art experience, because it's like, that's what I enjoy. So then my painting is just like a little trip back into the collective, as like, oh yeah, I'm kind of giving back a little bit to what I'm taking, essentially.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's interesting. Yeah, I guess everyone has their own process. So yeah, some people might not need art around, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
They have a different approach to even making it. It's like they're making it from a different place maybe, and there's different motivation or something. But yeah, for me, it's always been like, I love experiencing art or looking at painting, whether it's in a book or in person, And so yeah, just getting to make some of that myself. And you know, when I'm working on a painting, it's a struggle of the ugly stage, I say, where it's like starting a painting is exciting and then it's ugly for 98% of the time, and then you finish it and it's like, I love looking at it when it's finished and having it hanging in the house and just kind of like enjoying it as if almost like as if someone else painted it or something, and then working on a different one, but having it up to just like let it resonate and seep into your world, because there's like the slow burn of a painting where it's different than film or music or any of the temporal arts, where it's like it's just kind of static, but it's shifting because you're shifting and the light's shifting, and so there's this other quality to it that I find really interesting, but it takes a lot of time. Like it's a real subtle quality, so I want to have it hanging and living with it. And,
Yeah, interesting, yeah. I mean, go in a lot of directions with that. One thing I wonder about, I'm sure it's different for every artist and maybe even every piece, but like, is there a definite point when you know something is finished, or is it kind of, what is that process like for you?
It depends on the painting. Like sometimes it's sort of like, because I work from photo and collage, and so I have source imagery that I'm using, so it's like, oh, this is the thing, but like sometimes I'll work the painting and then I end up in a place where it's like, okay, I worked from the photo collage, I resolved that, and it still doesn't feel right, and I have to add something else or change something, like the painting is taking its own life on. But other times it's sort of like, oh no, it's just resolving it, and it's like, does it need another pass? Is it, you know, going to get too fussy if I go over it again and like tighten up the contrast, tighten up the details, and so it's more clear cut. But it kind of depends on the painting. But it always feels like chess again, where you're making your moves, and like at the beginning of the game there's infinite possibility, and even the first few moves, it opens up completely, and then it closes back down, where it's like there's only so many moves you can make in the game, because that's the end of that game. And the next game will be different, but it's like, oh, well, I thought this painting was going to be this, but it's over here now, and the only thing left to do is like put this last glaze on or something, and it's like, that's that painting. And whatever I thought I was making, I could try again to make that other thing, but I ended up with this like really calming down and like looking at the work and saying, well, what's actually here and what am I responding to, as opposed to like, oh, well, I had this idea in mind, I have to make that idea, and like forcing it into that, and not like allowing the paint to do the magic of paint, which is like serendipity and the kind of the subtlety that comes out of just a happy accident or a color shift that you didn't quite anticipate. And you just, if you're sort of intuitive enough, you can respond to that and be open to that. And there's no recipe to knowing when it's done. It's more like cultivating your intuition and just the practice of it, which is the beauty of it too, the unsolvability, and like living in the ambiguity of it is difficult as an artist, but it's also like, that is being the artist. Like the certainty that people have, or that you want to have, it's like you can't have that making art, so then you have to somehow find like a different calmness in the ambiguity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's what makes it art, right?
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and for a viewer too, like an unsolvable piece that feels like certain things, but it's so hard to describe, as opposed to like, here's a didactic, prescriptive idea about, well, this is how you should think about sunsets or whatever, and it's like, well, but they're complex. Life is it doesn't make sense. So then art doesn't need to make sense either. But that doesn't mean it doesn't need to have feeling or emotion. It's like it can be something without fully making sense in that way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And I'm curious, like, just to get more into like the journey you've been on, kind of going back to like, okay, so you started painting. You said you went to art school in New York, and then did you move back to rural Alberta, or what?
Well, I lived in different cities. So like I moved away from the family property when I was 18, mm-hmm. and moved back actually when I was 36. So it was kind of like, okay, I lived there for 18 years and I've been away for 18, and now it's like, oh, am I like teetering into the city? Am I going to just live in the city? And it was like, no, I got the call back to go home. But it was really wonderful to be gone for a while, live in different cities. I lived in Toronto and Vancouver, and I was in New York just briefly for kind of a course. I did my undergrad here in Lethbridge. Calgary was the city where I really felt like I connected with the idea of living in a city and started to kind of figure out how to live in a city as a country kid and like what that means, like how to build community in a space where there's strangers all the time and millions of people. And I started to cultivate it in the neighborhood of Bridgeland in Calgary, and it was like, oh, okay, I feel like I could actually stay here. And it was good, but then it was like, no, like that's still not my actual home. And coming back to this landscape I live in it's my space. And so that's really, it's informed my practice my whole life. So it's kind of.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I guess what sort of things, you might talk about this with Perry when we're looking at the pieces, but yeah, what sort of things, like, does that rural landscape or your home kind of bring out in your practice?
Yeah, living in that landscape, it's like it changes so much, but there's a consistency. There's a weird thread through it, and a sense of awe is something that I really have been cultivating in my work and trying to think about, like, what does that feel like? What does that mean? It's like, you know, there's the beauty of the sunset, but it's like that can steer into like the saccharine and the really, you know, it's like people don't even really look at it. They just are like, oh, I know what that is. It's a pretty sunset, and like you kind of don't connect. And it's like there's a different feeling there when you're standing and experiencing that, or like the country in the dark or something is another one. Like there's a quality that it's hard to describe, which I think is perfect for me because it's like it's a visual thing mostly, but I can feel it emotionally too. And then it's like, okay, how do I paint that? How do I express that? Like, can I do it with just color, the composition, like the subject matter, or like collaging, you know, different elements together, juxtaposing certain ideas. Like all of my paintings, I work from my own photographs, so I'm hiking around the property often with my camera and just catching things, and like I have a huge amount of photography, and then that trickles down into like a smaller amount of collage, and then that trickles down into like, okay, maybe these ones are paintings, and then that trickles further to like, oh, well, this one's actually getting worked on, and then like a few of them don't get finished, so then there's even a further trickle of like, oh, these are the paintings that kind of come from this larger process. But it's just like when I lived in other places and would come home and do photography and try and like, you know, I'm there for 3 days and I'm trying to like get as much material as possible. It was a really frantic approach, and whatever the light was and whatever the season was, it's like that's what I got. And so it was a different experience than like getting into the rhythm of the season. Like right now it's like, oh, it's cold out, I'm painting a lot, I'm not really taking a lot of pictures, but it's like I'm in a different rhythm. So it's like that's changed the practice quite a bit, of just actually getting to be there and kind of knowing like, oh, at this time of year the light kind of does this thing often, not always, but it's like there's kind of certain rhythms that I've been noticing, and then it's like, oh, okay, well then how does that seep into my work in a more organic way instead of like a frantic grasping at, oh, this is the shot because this is the only day I have to shoot or whatever. It's like, no, what can I like if I'm really quiet and listen and try and like trust the intuition, like what subject matter do I want to work on? Because for me, landscape, it's a loaded genre, kind of like the figure. It's like, oh, well, that's so overdone potentially, or like there's cliched pitfalls. But I also find that really interesting because it's like people understand landscape and figure in a very or I guess representational in general, but it's like kind of navigating those pitfalls and finding a fresh approach to that I find really interesting, because if you do manage to kind of connect in that way, I feel like the audience potential is quite big because people get it. Whereas abstract painting I feel like it takes a slightly more sophisticated painting language on the viewer's part, because it's so approachable as a beginner to just splash paint everywhere. But when I look at a beginner abstract and when I stand in front of like a Rothko or something, it's like, oh yeah, there's a reason that this is something that people fly to a city and visit and weep in front of. Like there is a palpable difference, but I don't know if it's as apparent as representational. So I like that kind of, that possibility that you can really connect with the average audience, but also like knowing more and more about art history, I can try and make something that has that nuance that is going to be beyond like the standard landscape, the standard figure. And I think for me, painting my specific landscape and living in that realm, it's like there's an emotional truth that I can feel or not feel if the painting isn't going well. And it's like, okay, it gives me something to really aim at that's beyond just like, oh, I want to make pretty paintings just for the sake of that.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I like that accessibility piece, because I feel like you mentioned with abstracts, perhaps for the average person, like, yeah, art may not be as accessible, or they may not see, they may not go to galleries. So yeah, that resonates with me for sure. That idea of making it, more accessible for the average person, I guess, but still having your artistic part of that as well. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I guess I'm curious, like, within your practice, like, eventually you decide you wanted to paint, and you studied painting, and you were painting all the time and doing that. Like, was it always like an idea of like, I want to be a professional painter, or was there kind of a shift at some point where you went like, this is fun, to like, this is something I want to do more seriously?
I think it's more like I've always just wanted to live the art life, which is like carving out as much time for myself as possible to pursue my craft, whether it's painting or script writing or whatever. It's just like I want the space and time to really cultivate that and like explore it. It's sort of like a process of self-actualization and self-discovery. And so it's like I just always wanted the time. So it was never like, oh, I need to make money with my art. And I don't, like, I've always had day jobs. Like, it's like, oh, what kind of day job is going to give me the most amount of time to paint and maybe like counteract something? So it's like, oh, I'm in the studio alone all the time, so maybe my day job should be at a coffee shop, because then I get to see people over and over and visit and kind of like have a social counterpoint to like the studio life. Or like I worked in an art supply store, because it's like, well, I can ask every professional artist that comes through the door, like, what are you using that for? And how do you do this? And it's like I learned almost more in my art supply days than I did in any of my other education, because I was able to really like talk shop with other artists, other professional artists. And it's like, yeah, so it's more about cultivating that. Like recently I've shifted where I'm putting more focus on my painting, and I'm in a couple of different galleries, and it's like, oh, I can lean into that more as sort of the professional sense of like, oh, I'm going to try and live off of it per se, but I've protected that for as long as possible. Like I've been painting for several decades, so it's like, okay, maybe now is the time to really lean into it. But in the beginning, it was the opposite. It's like protect my painting or my art practice as much as possible, and don't try and monetize it. It was like give myself total creative freedom, and that's, I think, why painting is sort of won out over something like filmmaking. Is it's like I have complete creative freedom. Like the only thing that holds me back in painting is like, can I paint that? And the more you learn the craft, it's like, oh, anything you can think, you can paint, basically. And so that's a beautiful thing to get to.
No, it's really interesting. Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective of carving out the time for your art and working your day job, your other life around that. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I assume that sounds like it was a very intentional kind of choice, like kind of early on.
Living another life too. Like I think if you, like I was mentioning, being chained to the easel and making the $20,000 paintings that takes you 6 months or whatever, it's like you're not living anything but just painting, and it's like you must be miserable doing that, and they sound miserable. They're like, oh, well, I can't paint fast enough, and I'm only getting because the gallery takes half. It's like I'm getting $15,000, but it's 6 months of work, and I can't afford to live. And it's like, that sounds terrible. And also, you're missing out on like actually living. Like, go hang out with your friends and play disc golf and go mountain biking and do stuff. Like, have other interests, because like that life lived is a connection and an experience that will make your art resonate with other people that are also living a life. Because if you're only kind of living in your art realm and studying art, you're making art that's referential to other art. You're making art for just the little clique of artists, which most of them don't necessarily care because they're busy making their own stuff. So it's like you're actually, like, you're missing what you're kind of role is potentially in society. So it's like, yeah, you should open that up as much as possible. And I try and do that more and more all the time, like pursue other interests and, you know, find that balance. So it's not just like, oh, painting or whatever.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, yeah. And so it sounds like even though you are doing more painting and selling paintings and it's more on the professional side, you're still able to maintain that balance?
I think so, yeah. I mean, who knows? Like if my paintings start selling like hotcakes and, you know, it's like, oh, well, okay, there's going to be maybe a period where I lose that a little bit, but I think I've built a really strong foundation of that idea in myself and in my practice, and really cultivated what I think I want to do with my practice. So I think it'll be harder for me to be swayed by a market, say, where it's like, oh, well, these paintings are selling right now, you need to make a bunch more. And it's like, maybe I would want to because I still am interested in that idea, but kind of knowing like, oh, am I doing this for the right reason? And like being self-reflective enough to really notice that. I think I've been cultivating that for a long enough time that I wouldn't get swept away in that, but you know, who knows?
Guess you'll see, yeah.
Money is a wild thing, so
right?
Anything could happen, but.
Yeah. But no, I think that's good. I mean, based on what you said, that you at least are aware of that in yourself. And
right.
Yeah, I guess if suddenly you were amazingly successful in the art world, that I'm assuming, so hypothetically, if someone's like, I'm going to pay you $1 million for this piece or whatever, but it sacrificed your quality of life, would you kind of maybe think twice, possibly?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I would like to think so. Like, because it's like money doesn't buy happiness, and I mean, you hear those stories all the time. Like, they've done studies about people winning the lottery, and it's like almost all of them, their quality of life plummeted because of that amount of money. Like it, you know, the fantasy of that money is only fantasy, and when you actually get stuck with it, it's like you are stuck with it. Like you have a different level of responsibility, and everyone comes out of the woodwork and wants to get a piece of it, and it's like this quiet, nice little life you had is sort of flipped upside down, and the money can just disappear too, because it's like if you start splashing it around, it's gone, and you don't really have anything to show for it. So yeah, like I think having the time for me was always the thing. It's like I would like the time and space to be able to explore the ideas, which now that I'm living where I'm living, it's like that I have it. So it's like, oh, I'm there. Like all I have to do is just keep enjoying it until I run out of days to paint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's great that you've found that and you'll be able to go back to where you grew up and tap into that for sure. Yeah, because I feel like that's so important. I think for any art making, probably especially painting, as far as like you said, connecting to that place and spending time there. And it just seems like like such a stark contrast, like you mentioned, being Calgary, which might work for some artists. Yeah. But it sounds like for you, it's slowing down and taking time and appreciating the seasons and things like that. Yeah.
And I go up to Calgary a lot. Like that's still my art community for the most part. So I wish it was a little bit closer, but also like I've been told, well, if you were closer, you'd be busy. Like, you know, I'm 4 hours away from Calgary, and people that come out, they're like, oh yeah, I've left the sort of radius of the city where people are out camping or doing whatever. Like there's kind of this big circle of people around the city trying to escape the city, but they only go so far. And I'm just outside of that circle, so it's like it's true isolation, which is wonderful. So it just means, a bit more driving to connect to the community. But I'm glad that I have both, and if I wouldn't have moved away as a kid, like I would just, I wouldn't be making the art I'm making. I would be maybe not even making art at all, although that's hard to picture, but I think I'd just be making very much outsider art and maybe raising cows to go along with that as my day job or something. But
yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, and you mentioned like people saying, oh, you'd be busier if you were, let's say, in Calgary. And do you mean like busier with your art?
No, it's the feel of like the stimulation of the city. Like I just feel like it's harder to kind of listen to my own voice and not be sort of pulled in all these different directions. Like just the visual distraction of the city, and also the noise of the city in general. Like just there's so much happening, and so it was like I was starting to kind of carve out my spot and figure out how to find balance in that. But I think the space I'm in now, it's like, I can really sink into it and then go to Calgary, stay a couple days with friends, visit, go to openings, like get all that stuff and actually probably go to more openings now that I don't live there than when I did. Because when you live in the space, it's like, oh, I could go to the next one. I'll just stay home and paint. And I would push off things. And now it's like, oh, I'm in the city. I'm going to actually go out and do stuff and then go home and have the contrast. And yeah, so it seems to work really well for me to have both. And
yeah, it seems very intentional. And I know, I mean, Perry and I talk about this more in the acting theater side, but maybe it's the same with any art of like being where the people are and where the art galleries are and stuff. And I feel like there's perhaps, at least in the artist's mind, that pressure that I need to live in the big centers.
Oh, sure.
Did you feel that?
A little bit. I think that's what pulled me away from the farm in the first place, is like, oh, I need to go connect. I need to meet other people. I need to see things, like challenge my ideas. Like going to art school, it's just like, here's a bunch of art, and you're just getting exposed to hundreds of different types of art and artists, and it's just like, wow, like all of this stuff is out there in the world, and it really just opens up possibility for you. And then you're kind of like, well, what stuff do I want? It's a big buffet of possibility, and it's like, well, what resonates with me? And yeah, cultivating that. But yeah,
at the same time, it sounds like, at least for you, again, it's like, okay, the busyness and that lifestyle just didn't suit you. And you need
I think it's more in like dribs and drabs, and it's like, yeah, if you want to really go to the Mecca, it's like, go to New York and like try and live in a bolt hole and like make art there. And it's like, I have a brother that lives there and works a non-art job, and so he can actually afford to be there, and I go visit him, and it's wonderful because it's like, oh, I'm going to go and connect with that sort of stuff, and then come back to my space. And it's like, I don't have to try and like live off of tin soup and in abject poverty to make it as an artist when there's like 200,000 other people doing the exact same thing. It's like, instead I can sit back and kind of look at like the beautiful sort of privilege I was born into with like, oh, I grew up in the country, I can still be here. Like, that's something that I can share with people in New York, and they can come visit me and go, oh, this is really cool. And yeah, so it's kind of leaning into like what I have, or like the opportunities of my own sort of unique existence in my space, and not trying to be like, oh, this is the path that everyone takes, because it's like anyone that does that is kind of ignoring whatever they started with, and maybe giving themselves like a handicap because they're trying to do the exact same version of like, oh, this is how you become a famous painter or something, is like go to New York and knock on the door of the gallery or something.
Yeah, you're right. I think people have to find their own path, and it sounds like, you moved away and then you came back, and it seems like you figured that out. I think it sounds like, for you at least.
Yeah. Well, at least to a point. It's never stable as that, but it's like, I've gotten to a place where I think it's like there's a lot of yeses, and then whatever ambiguity is just part of the whole thing. But
yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. I guess I could ask you 100 different questions, but we are a little short on time, so I'll ask the final question that we ask all of our guests is, if you can answer this, is like, how has your art, your painting, like changed you as a person?
It's about trying to find that balance and that like letting go of certain things. So it's like when I was trying to learn how to paint, it was, oh, I want to paint this photo or this life subject and make it look like the thing, and like really forcing the paint to be something and wanting to control it and grasping at a certain preconceived idea of what it looks like. And I could see that tension, and like the painting I liked of other people's, it's like, it doesn't have that. It doesn't have that kind of strain. And it's like, oh, I'm feeling that strain in myself and my back and like, and it's like, oh, doing yoga and meditation and stuff. It's like, oh, I'm letting go of that. I can let go of that in my painting too, and I'm getting better result in the painting. So it's like a direct visual representation of like, oh, this is how to live a more balanced, calmer life, is like, and then you get a better painting as a result of it. And I think the reason it's better is people resonate with that, like letting the material be the material and not choking the life out of it, and just there's a calmness there that's, you're kind of accepting things as they come rather than trying to force them or grasp at them. So yeah, that's what I've sort of continue to learn. It's like a mirror of that state of myself, because it's always a flux, but
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting how it would also influence your painting, and perhaps people could hopefully get a sense of that. Yeah, great. Yeah, well, yeah, this is, I guess, all the time we have for this segment. So it's been really interesting, Daniel, learning about your journey as an artist and how you came to painting. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of your work and having Perry talk about it. So this has been the Windy City's Finest.
Hello and welcome once again to the Windy City's Finest, on location here in the LA Gallery with Mac and Perry. He's Mac, I'm Perry, and this is
Daniel.
And I'm super excited to dive into our showcase segment with you, Daniel. And I also really wanted to just preface this by saying I appreciated in your conversation with Mac talking about that process of like distilling. So starting with photography, and you have quite a lot of photographs, and then you have so many projects that you're working on, and then actually the ones that actually get finished, and just that kind of process of distilling, I found very interesting. And I also really loved sunsets. I absolutely love sunsets, and I love soaking them in and just taking time to actually sit in them and understand what's happening and how beautiful they are. And you have a piece here that I'm going to pull up, and I'm just curious what you can tell us about this piece initially, and we'll see what else comes to mind.
Well, it's on the Milk River, so it's a photo I took on a canoe trip. So I'm floating down the river, and yeah, the sun is setting, so I'm getting this beautiful experience of being on the water with the sunset, just magical. And you photograph it, it looks like crap. It never really has the feeling of being there, but the photo gives me certain details I can use, and when I'm taking the pictures, I'm exposing for the sky, knowing that digital photography, you can kind of pull information out of the underexposed sort of strip of trees and riverbank, and it's like, okay, there's going to be enough there to work from detail-wise, but the color is, especially like all of this color is just going to look like garbage in the photo. And so then it's like, as a painter, and then remembering the experience, it's like I can pull that information out, I can play with those colors to try and really make it feel like, oh yeah, this is the experience of being on the river as the sun's setting. And this is a river that I grew up on, that I live beside, and so I've canoed it hundreds of times, and moonlight canoe trips, sunset canoe trips, like that kind of magic hour time of day is something I really go back to. Like the midday blazing sun canoe trip is the worst one to do, and I almost never do it. So like this to me is a very familiar time of day, and so I was just challenging myself with expressing that in the paint, and there's something about painting water that just is so magical and delicious as far as a viewer's perspective, like seeing shiny things, like it's just it really resonates. So it's a series that I keep coming back to, like that kind of the pink sky sunset. There's so many beautiful pink skies in this country, so yeah, it's
Yeah, and I also love that idea of like, you may have seen, this river bank hundreds of times, but something really spoke to you this sunset, like on this day. And I don't know, because I feel like a lot of the times, our audiences are people. We go through the same things or the same routes or we see the same things a lot of the time, and I think sometimes we then don't give them the time or energy they maybe deserve, and we find those like the beauty, I guess. And so I really appreciated that. And also this idea of, were you out there specifically taking photos, or were you like?
No, it's more like when I'm out doing stuff, like going canoeing or hiking around, I've got my camera with me and just catching photos all the time. Because it's digital too, it's like, I can take hundreds of photos. And so I'm really liberal with allowing myself to kind of, that might be interesting, take a photo, because it's like I can distill it down, like you say, and just make decisions later, crop it, figure it out, and then I keep revisiting photos, and often it'll be like I'll remember a photo that I took and be thinking about it while I'm working on different paintings and going like, okay, there's something in that composition, in the light, in my memory of the event too. And it's just like, oh, it's gelling for me, and it's still there weeks later, months later, years later, and it's like, okay, there's not just like the novelty sort of excitement, there's genuine interest, and then I can pursue it, because it takes a long time to make a painting, so I don't want to just go down the wrong path all the time and waste time. It's like, okay, but snapping the picture is easy, so I can just collect images and then start playing with them. Like I tweak them in Lightroom to sort of try and get the image as close to my memory as possible. Like the better reference I can photograph, the easier it is to kind of express it, that next little step to the memory of the actual experience. But yeah.
I love that. It sounds like an idea of your photography is kind of like getting all these little doors and taking like creating these doors that you could open and go down, or paths, and really honing into, you mentioned like your intuition a couple times, and that balance between what you can physically capture, playing against your memory, and using that with your intuition to figure out which doors to open and go down.
And having a wide swath of information kind of allows the most intuition, because it's like, oh, I've got a bunch of choices, and I'm really open at the start, and then I've filtered a little bit and filtered a little bit, so it's like it's keeping it as open as possible for as long as possible. And then even in the painting, it's like I can make decisions about color, and I can sometimes just go totally off the rails and be like, well, this photo and the painting don't even look remotely like each other, but I followed a different thread in the paint itself, which that's a newer part of my practice. Like initially learning the craft, it was like, make the photo, like really, because it was hard to do that. And so there was a lot of effort spent just in the craft of making the exact color I'm looking at in the photo, or from life if I'm doing a still life or something. And it's like I can let go of that more as I kind of develop further as an artist, which I find really exciting. It's like it's just opening up a new vista that's like, oh, okay, I wasn't ready for this 20 years ago or something, but like now I've put in the time that I can let go a little bit. And
sounds like kind of learning the rules so that you can break them, maybe.
That totally is one way to look at it.
And talking about colors, just because I think it's very interesting as far as color is concerned. So you also mentioned that idea of like the landscape in the dark, and I think that maybe when people think of darkness, there's maybe not a lot there, but but I feel like there is, and I'm curious what you meant by that, or what you could share about this piece in particular.
Psychologically, there's the idea of darkness in the country, which I find really interesting. Like, I kind of think of it as superstitious dread, as opposed to, you're in the city and it's dark, and it's never really quite dark in the city anyway, but like you're going down a dark alley or something, and it's like someone could murder you or attack you for whatever reason, and it's like, that's something tangible to be afraid of. And yet out in the country, it's really interesting. I'll bring people from Calgary or wherever out there, and they don't want to go out in the dark. And even myself, like I feel a different energy in the valley at night, and it's really quite eerie and unsettling, but I tend to lean into it because it's like, oh, I'm searching for these strong emotions and I want to experience this stuff. But it's, I say superstitious dread because it's like, there's not this hypothetical murderer around the next corner, but there's still an uncanny quality to the valley in the dark, and I find it really interesting and very palpable. So then as a painter trying to capture that, it's like I'm out there still using a camera because I want the specificity of detail that the camera provides, where it's like I want the feel of a real space. Depending on how much of that information I use or not, I still want that raw data. So I have to go out, like this particular one, the camera's on a tripod, and I'm doing long exposures, and then I'm kind of burning and dodging in the way you would in like darkroom photography with the enlarger. I'm doing it in real time on the landscape with big flashlights and kind of like big long exposures, and going, okay, if I shine the flashlight here for 5 seconds and then over here for 8 seconds and then the shutter closes, it's like, what kind of image do I get? And you can look in real time on the back of the camera, which is amazing because otherwise I'd have to go and develop it and come back again. But it's like, no, I can check this stuff and get something, and then later think again about like, oh, well, the camera totally fell apart in this part of the image, but I know what it looked like because I also was just standing there soaking up that experience and then trying to express it. So I feel like night landscape is really a unique spot for my painting to explore because it's almost impossible to get good night photography because there's just so much noise and crap. But you know, when I paint, I just don't paint the crap, and then it's not even difficult. It's not like photoshopping it out. It's just I don't put it into the canvas. I just put in what is expressing that mood, and so it's I love painting these night landscapes, and I'm gonna do a whole bunch more for sure.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I love what you're saying about kind of leaning into your memory of it and how that kind of informs what you end up doing, and versus what you can actually feasibly capture in the moment, but that you're actually taking that time to be present and not having to worry about, oh, if I don't capture it right now, it's going to be gone because I'll have to go and do the things and then come back. It's like you really are able to kind of sit in this space on that day at that time.
Yeah, I try and do that as much as possible. And like sometimes you get carried away in the technology and like taking the picture, but it's like, no, just like look with your eyeballs, and then even like look at the screen of what it's showing the photo is maybe going to look like, because it's going to look a little bit better on your computer or whatever, but it's like compare that to like what is the experience and what is the camera and the technology missing that you're feeling, and then later you can really think about that and remember it. And it helps that I'm always painting this landscape that I'm really steeped in, so it's like I've been soaking it up for my whole life basically. Like it's the point where it'd be like, oh, what's that thing over there? And it's like there's a little dot in this sort of valley, and it's like, oh, that's a deer or something. It's like a new dot because you're so used to all the little sandstone shapes and all the little bushes and everything, that if there's a new black dot across the valley, you're like, oh, that must be something. Oh, is that a deer, or is that a cougar, or oh, there's a person standing there. It's like a vertical dot. Like you notice it immediately, and it's so interesting because it's not like you're trying to train for it. You're just soaking it up, and it just becomes like this language, and you know, being in that one space. So yeah, and I love that attention to detail that you're not necessarily working at, but it's that idea that you see it so many times, but you're also engaging with it, even though it's the quote-unquote same every time. You're still engaging with it like intentionally, so that when it does change, it's like it's like special, like there's energy there maybe. So, totally. And I also kind of, is there a parallel for you between landscapes and figure? Yes, it's some, or like one informs the other. And so I taught myself how to paint with the figure. There's a specificity in the figure that I found really challenging, and there was a certain kind of figure I was trying to capture, female beauty, and if it's wrong in the slightest way, even a little kid can be like, what's wrong with her face? Or like, why is her shoulder all mangled? Like we read that, like the contour of the body is so specific. And so for me, really trying to teach myself how to paint post-university, where I really was focused on trying to paint representationally as opposed to kind of exploring painting in a more conceptual way, it was like, oh, this is the challenge for me. And I had enough interest in that particular subject, and still do, that it was like, oh, this is gonna sustain me over these long, painful experiences of just struggling with the material and struggling with understanding how to work with it and create something that reads the way that I see it or the way that I want to feel it. And yeah, it informed my landscape, because the landscape doesn't really have that edge. It doesn't have that contour. And so then it would be so much easier to start painting and just be like, oh, I'm doing landscape, and you just flow into these vague spaces, and no one can be like, oh, that tree isn't in the right spot, or it's not the right size. Whereas you know, if the breasts are lopsided or something, it's gonna read immediately. So it's it gave, the figure gave me a control that then doing the landscape, I could kind of use that knowledge to push certain things. And then the landscape presented its own challenges of atmospheric perspective and no specificity of like focus of subject. It's like, well, there's a different challenges there. So then that goes back into the figure of like letting go certain areas and like allowing for ambiguity in places. And so they're kind of a cyclical thing. Like for a long time it was like, oh, I shouldn't paint this, or I should paint this, and I was kind of like, which one, and you know, where does it all fit? And the animals are maybe the hybrid between them. But now I'm like, oh, actually all of them are a part of my practice in such enmeshed ways that it's really hard to parse them.
Yeah, I love what you're saying about specificity, and I also, you mentioned that this is maybe one of your newer pieces, and you were able to kind of let go a little bit of painting representationally, I think you had said, and so did that happen with this one?
Yeah, to some extent. Like I look at this compared to like even the little one up there, I don't know if we can see it, but it's like there's a tightness that I tend to get into when I'm painting the figure, where I'm really drilling down on specificity of form and contour and like just tiny detail, and you get sucked into that, and that's the point where you start choking the life out of the paint, and kind of your ego is taking over. Like I can make the thing look exactly like the thing, as opposed to just breathing a little bit and like letting areas just be paint, where it's like if you looked at the photo of this or the real person next to this painting, you're like, oh yeah, that's clearly a painting. It's not, the detail isn't quite all finished. There's a lot of marks that are quite loose, but the details that matter to me, that kind of give the form the cohesion and give the body the sort of the energy that I want it to have, they're all there in the way that I feel like, yep, I'm happy with them. But I've stopped myself from doing the 10 extra steps past that and just like let it be enough. Like this one's about the richness of the color and the shape of her body and the way the light's kind of catching her in different ways and like bisecting the body and distorting it. And it's like all of that is there now. If I were to just spend an extra week like painting the belly button curve or something, it's like it's not adding anything. In fact, it's taking away from that. So that's kind of where I stop with that one.
I think we're kind of at our time for this segment, but I think that's a really good poignant point to end off on, of that it sounds like you started to really like be able to hone and acknowledge is when are you doing stuff that is kind of past the point of return, I guess, like getting a return on it.
Yeah, know when to stop and just let it be enough. And
And it brings to mind in our first segment, I believe, that idea of prison of your practice. And it sounds like that's kind of the point there. Yeah,
like if you go to the atelier and you learn how to paint like the old masters and everybody's painting looks identical, it becomes a prison. And you're stuck there. So it's like, letting go a little bit and letting your own mark show through. So it's like, this is your painting and no one else can make it. It's like handwriting, you write a letter, it looks like you're writing. You don't have to try and make it your writing. It just happens. But you have to just let that happen.
Just gotta let it happen, people. I think that's a great note to end off on. So thank you so much. This has been the Windy City's Finest on location here at the LA Gallery with Mac and Perry.